GrandMasters.com viewers. I'd like to welcome you back to another short series of videos. My name is Simon Williams, so you may have seen some of the other videos I've done for you so far. Some ideas in the Budapest Gambit, also on attacking play. And this short series we're going to do now of 5 videos is going to be really a combination of looking at the classical Dutch. So a variation in the Dutch defence, which is one of the most aggressive ways of meeting 1d4 that I'm probably most famous for playing. And it's an opening that is a favourite of mine. I think it's a very good opening, a very aggressive opening. It's helped me personally to beat some of the, well, have some of my greatest victories, should I say, in the world. I managed to defeat Gelfand just after his world championship match with Anand. So I think I was one of the first people, maybe the first person to defeat Gelfand with the black pieces after his match with Anand for the world championships. That was in the Dutch defence. In the game we're going to have a look at here, I'm playing the very strong Polish player, Wojciech, who's actually Anand's second. And so that's I've had good results against the Anand family. And Wojciech is 27-20. And in this game, I completely destroyed him in 20 moves with this very interesting opening that we're going to look at. So as well as looking at Dutch defence, I also want to combine this with attacking ideas and when it's a good idea to push for the attack. Because in most of these games, the opening has started off with the Dutch and that is a very solid and good opening. But at a certain moment, I've just gone for the attack. So I think this is also going to combine elements of when to attack, in what positions you should attack from, and when you know the basis of a good attack. So the classical Dutch is an opening. Well, there's 3 types of opening Dutch. So let's just have a look at the first move. So d4, and now the Dutch proper is played with 1 f5. So this is the way you normally enter into the Dutch opening with black. And it's quite interesting because not many people play the Dutch. But if you think about the most popular opening against 1 e4, so if you think after e4, what's black's most popular reply here? Well, e5, obviously, but the other most popular reply and the most aggressive reply is c5, the Sicilian. And really what you're doing when you're playing the Dutch, after d4, f5, you're playing really a reversed Sicilian. If you think about the pawn movements there, this is kind of similar to a Sicilian. So it's a very aggressive opening in its nature. And already you're trying to gain control of the central square. Now, I always play the Dutch defence after d4, well, not always, but most of the time, by playing 1 e6 first. Now, you might think, well, why do I play 1 e6? Well, after d4, f5, there are a number of sidelines and gambit lines which you have to be well prepared for. For example, there's the Staunton Gambit, which I know Thomas Rendell has done an excellent video on for chess.com, which is very dangerous unless you know what you're doing from black. And there's just lots of moves that black has to be wary of. So an interesting move order after 1 d4 is a move order 1 e6. Now, the only downside of this move order is that you have to be prepared for e4. And here, your best option is obviously to enter into a French defense with d5. And this, again, might not suit everyone. So if you're a French defense player, though, this would be, I think, a very good way of starting the game, 1 e6. So it's just a slight move order nuance. Okay, and now there's lots of different setups. And what we're going to really consider in these first 5 videos is just the main setup from white. So this is the theoretically recommended setup from white. This is what I get in most of my games. And this is what we're really going to concentrate on. And the setup in question is with knight to f3 here. And now I enter into a Dutch defense. So, of course, I play f5. Now, white's move order can be different here. White could have gone c4 last move. He could have gone g3. As black, you always have to be very aware of your opponent's move order. So do not play quickly in your opening, in the Dutch. If your opponent plays something you're not maybe expecting, that'd be a good moment to slow down and just try to think, well, they've played something different here. Can I still get my normal move order? Now, I'm just going to tell you what we're aiming for as black already on move 2. Now, your setup you're aiming for with black in the classical Dutch is with knight to f6, bishop to e7, castle's kingside. And now, rather than the stone wall Dutch, in the stone wall Dutch, you put your pawn on d5. In the classical Dutch, you put your pawn on d6. So this is your standard setup. So your standard setup, we normally go knight to f6 first. And then once we play knight to f6, we go bishop to e7, so we're able to castle. Once we've got the knight and bishop out the way, we can then castle our king. Once the king is castled, we put our pawn on d6. And one of the main ideas of the classical Dutch is to push forwards with e5 later on. So this is one of the main ideas in the classical Dutch. But so to do this, you prepare it with d6. Okay, well, let's see how the game continued here. Way to check my very strong opponent to play g3. And this is considered the main setup from white. White will often fianchetto his bishop on g2 and try to gain control of the center like this. Now, other setups we will consider in a new series of videos, but I think this is the most common setup, so we'll get used to the main ideas in black here. So now I continue the plan I mentioned before. My opponent also develops, so I play bishop e7, both sides to castle. My opponent now plays c4, which is the standard move, gaining space in the center with the pawns. And now, unlike the stone wall Dutch, we play d6. And this is the main, I should say, starting point for the classical Dutch, this position. In the classical Dutch, here, we have our pawns on d6, e6, and f5. Now, it may look a bit cramped, so let's just talk about the main ideas here for black. Well, some of your main ideas, your main strategical idea, you can't achieve this immediately, but your main strategical idea is to break with e5 at some moment. And you'll see that in this game, this idea works perfectly. So e5 is your main strategic idea, gaining very strong pawns in the center of the board. And if you compare this position after you get e5 in, it's actually very similar to a reverse Grand Prix attack. Any players out there who know the Grand Prix attack from the white side, this is actually very like that position, but from the black perspective. Now, other ideas you try to do very common in this opening is knight to e4. This is one idea I'm going to suggest you try to play in a lot of positions. And after knight to e4, you try to follow this move up with bishop to f6. And you'll slowly see that these rather passive pieces on f6 and e7 suddenly take up very good squares. So the knight on f6 jumps into e4. The bishop on e7 jumps into f6, trying to attack along this diagonal. Later on, we'll see in my game against Gelfand this idea working very well. You also often play the move a5 to try to gain space on the queen side to hit out against the b4 square. And one very typical idea, which is the main idea in this game, is the idea of queen to e8 to h5. And this is a caveman style chess. You may have seen my caveman commentary before. And this is basically a caveman idea, a very, very important idea in the classical Dutch. Try to put your queen onto the h5 square and to start an attack against the white king. Now, the ideal setup would be queen on h5, pawn on e5. So just try to picture this happening in the future. Obviously, white gets some moves as well. Pawn on f4, and the bishop on c8 then comes jumping into the game to h3, and your knight on f6 comes to g4. Now, that's a lot of paint on the board I've got there, so we'll just get rid of all this paint on the board, all these diagrams and arrows. But if you can just see, those are the main ideas. And I think when you're learning an opening, the main ideas are more important. So generally, do not worry about your bishop on c8 and your knight on b8. Leave these two pieces on their starting squares. These two guys can get developed later on in the game because you don't have to worry about them too much. Now, one thing you also have to be careful of doing is playing knight c6 too soon. If you play knight c6 too soon, it will allow your opponent to go d5, attacking your knight. And this is something you want to avoid. Now, after the move I played, d6, if white plays d5 here, which he doesn't actually play in the game, this would be a strategical mistake from white. Now, you can already maybe ask yourself why from the hints I've given you in this introduction to this game. What is one strategical idea that black's trying to achieve from this opening? Well, the idea is e5. And if you can achieve the move e5, this helps your position greatly. It now supports the f4 break, very important idea, and the caveman attack of going queen e8, queen h5, f4, bishop h3 is that little bit easier to achieve now. Your opponent's actually just helped your plan. So this would be a mistake, this move d5 from white. My opponent played queen to c2. A logical kind of move. White's strategical break is e4. You want to try to aim or stop this break e4. I played a move on the queen side now, gaining space on the queen side, something I mentioned briefly, a5. My opponent develops his knight to c3. It's a very logical play now. And in this position, my opponent is preparing to play the move e4. Now that his queen's on the c2 square, I'm able to play knight to c6. And this is a move that works out very well, because if my opponent now plays d5, his queen is slightly exposed on c2. So how can you get that strategical position that we mentioned earlier with your pawn on e5? Well, you can get that position by playing knight to b4, attacking the queen. Now, if the queen was on d1 in this position, white would have time to destroy your pawn structure with pawn takes e6, but this is not possible here. After queen b3, you can now go e5, and you've gained, again, your ideal pawn structure. So this is exactly the kind of thing you should be aiming for. Okay, so let's just go back. So d5 is a mistake here. Now, if your opponent plays e4 here, the way you need to meet this is with e5. One thing that's, you have to try to get e5 in at nearly all costs. Now, one thing worth mentioning very quickly, the position you will always want to avoid in the classical Dutch is a position where you take on e4, your opponent captures on e4, everything gets exchanged on e4, and you reach this kind of pawn structure. Now, if you're not able to break with e5 in this kind of position, then you have a very big weakness on the e6 square, and white is clearly better in this type of position. So this is something you always try to avoid. So whenever your opponent plays e4, always be ready to meet it with a move e5. Okay, in the game, my opponent played b3. So this allows me to now play my strategical idea, e5. My opponent now captured on e5. Opening up the d file, I recapture back my pawn, so I have these two strong pawns in the center of the board. My opponent played what looks like a natural move, rook to d1. But of course, this allows me to accelerate my attacking idea now. Queen to e8. My idea, as I mentioned before, queen h5, f4, bishop h3, checkmate. Checkmate is the end of the game, so no messing about here. My opponent now played knight to b5. And here, we now come on to an attacking aspect of the game. And this is the position I kind of mentioned, as well as being theoretical. It's really, I thought now it's time to launch an attack at all costs. So it's really an all-in move, a very committal idea I now played. I actually let my opponent just take my pawn on c7 and take my rook on a8, because I thought my attack was going to be very strong here. And I think it's a very interesting idea what I did. Rather than defend against my c7 pawn where I lose tempo, I thought my attack combined with the idea of queen here, bishop on c5, pawn on f4 was going to be extremely strong. So I gave up all material on the queen side just to gain tempo. And this comes to timing in chess. I think it's very important to gain as much time as you can when attacking. So I simply play queen to h5 here, going for the caveman attack. My opponent obviously took on c7, winning a pawn. And now I played pawn to f4. So not even worrying about my rook on a8. And the point is here, I'm just ignoring my opponent's plan and I'm trying to gain as much time as I can to launch an attack myself. It's all about timing. My opponent's a much higher rated player than me. So I thought it's a good idea just to attack him. Again, if you're playing someone higher rated, then I think it's a good idea just to throw all your bits at his king. My opponent now took on a8, and I got another piece into the attack, bishop to c5. And even though I'm a whole rook and pawn down, I now have some very strong threats against my opponent's king on g1. My bishop on c5 takes up a very good attacking square, attacking against f2. My bishop on c8 can come running in to try to get rid of the defender on g2, his defensive piece there. My knight on f6 is ready to jump into the game to g4 when there's pressure against f2 and h2. My pawn on the f4 square can take in the apart by taking on g3. My rook on f8 can even play a part in the attack. So all my remaining pieces, even my knight on f6, on c6, which can come to b4, have a very good attacking role here. And this is another thing when you're trying to start an attack. It's about timing, but you need to look at the potential that your pieces have. And in this position, my pieces have a lot of potential. They have very good squares they can jump into. They have very good attacking squares. They have very good rolls. So I thought this is worth time. Now, in the game, my opponent already blundered under pressure already with rook to d5. And we'll come back to this quickly. Now, I think a critical variation here would be something like, I'm just going to show you one line which shows the dangers to white's position. Let's say my opponent now played knight to c7, which looks a perfectly logical move, trying to get the knight back into the game, maybe to d5, etc. Well, here I can play knight to b4 first, and this really comes back to the principle of thinking of what piece is not taking part in the attack. Well, I've pointed out nearly every piece, and after knight to b4, well, this piece now takes a very good role in the attack, attacking the queen. Now, one interesting variation here, if queen to c3, this does allow bishop takes f2 check. And in this position, if king takes f2, knight to e4 check, very dangerous for my opponents. So instead, queen to b2 looks more sensible. But now all our pieces start rocking and rolling here. When you're attacking, when you're material down, it's so important to keep the initiative up. You have to keep attacking. And this is one example of this. Knight to g4. Pressure against these two squares. No time to take a break. Have to keep going forwards with our pieces. And now let's say knight to d5 was played, trying to get the knight back into the game. Well, now I think a very interesting line would be bishop takes f2 check. The king is very badly placed on h1 because then I just continue pawn takes g3. So let's say he tries to run away, king to f1. Now, again, look at the pieces that are not taking part in the attack if you cannot see an immediate win. Well, the rook on f8 is not taking part, so pawn takes g3 looks very logical. And now, well, this pawn's getting very dangerous, so white should probably take back the pawn. And here, well, a good move here and probably a winning move is bishop takes g3 when the attack is just too strong here. You can try defending this at home if you want to have a look at this position at home, but actually a much more attractive and beautiful way to play this position, and a way I've won this position before, would be queen to h2. And this, look at this move. I think it's an absolutely stunning and beautiful move, a really amazing move. And one of the ideas behind this move is we're just trying to get all our pieces into attack. And this is one thing you really need to look at when you attack. And clearly, knight takes h2 does not work because knight takes h2 is checkmate, believe it or not. Unbelievable queen sacrifice. And now, well, I actually had one game here where my opponent continued with a3. Now, viewers, can you see black's idea behind queen to h2? It wasn't just a pretty queen move where the queen comes in and aims to come to some square. It had some real good idea behind it. So checkmate in two moves now. Queen to g1, check. Lovely queen sacrifice, only one move. Knight takes g1. We've now made a square for our g4 knight. So knight to h2 is checkmate. I think a very beautiful checkmate there. And again, we can just see how dangerous this attack can be. So the openings actually worked out very well. I'll show you the rest of the game very quickly. My opponent literally cracked from what happened from this real strong attack I gained. And it just shows you how dangerous this opening can be if one of the top players in the world doesn't know how to handle it. Well, my opponent continued rook d5, trying to give up material. But the game ended very quickly. Knight b4, getting another piece into the attack. My opponent tried to give up his rook to make things easier. But now I just took a lot of material. Won't go into the complications too much because the position quickly simplifies. His rook on a1 is attacked. And now I'm not even material down. So knight takes g3. And still I'm attacking even though the queens have been swapped off the board. And after rook b2, bishop to f5, my strong opponent resigned and moved 20. His knight is being attacked. It's equal material. And I'm also threatening to go knight takes e2 check and knight takes f1. And I'm going to be a piece up very soon. So I think a good introduction to the classical Dutch there. A nice attacking game, I thought. And it was just kind of all in chess there. Now, just to talk about the key moments, when you're starting the game here, you set up with bishop e7, castles, and d6. We talked about some of the various ideas you had. Now, if your opponent's queen comes to c2, you can try to prepare the e5 move. So I went a5 first to secure a square on the b4 square. After knight c3, I now was able to play this move. And as soon as you're able to play e5, I've supported this move now with my knight. So e5 was played. And after my queen comes to e8, I had this very strong attacking idea of queen h5, f4, bishop to c5, followed up with bishop h3 and knight g4 with a very big attack. So a bit of a long video there, I'm afraid, but I hope you enjoyed that introduction to the Dutch defence, and I hope that's given you a good taster to what the Dutch defence can be. There'll be more videos in this series shortly, and, well, I hope some of you are brave enough to play this in future. We now come to the second game in this series on the classical Dutch defence that I'm going to take a look at. I'm going to use most of my own games just because I have more knowledge of what's going on if I use my own games. And of course, my opponents in each of these games are extremely strong players. They're all 2,700 plus opponents. So the person I'm facing here, well, I'm facing Alexei Shirov. Now, Shirov is one of my favourite players of all time. He's an absolute crazy, mad hacker attacker. And I've played Shirov now 3 times, each time with the black pieces, and I've scored 0 out of 3. So he's got the better of me, but he's a much better player than me. But he's such a great player. He always tries to come and attack you. He always plays very aggressive chess. And his attacking play is just real joy to watch. So whenever I play Shirov, I always get very excited, and I always find it quite an occasion. Now, in my other games, when I've played Shirov for black, he's always played e4. And I think after this game, he said something along the lines of, I'm always going to stick to e4 in future against you. Just because he played into my classical Dutch in this game. But even though I lost the game, it clearly wasn't the fault of the opening, and I probably just had a nice advantage from the opening. So let's go through the opening moves again. I'll try to explain them bit by bit. So we had a look at the ideas in the Wojciech game previously, but I will try to enforce some of the main ideas as we go along here. So d4 was played. Now, f5 is the normal way of entering into the Dutch defence, as we mentioned before. The way I normally prefer to enter the opening is by e6, because I played a French defense. Now, I think this move order will generally work quite well, but you might have to have some knowledge of what to do after the move e4, d5. Obviously, that's a completely new opening, a French defense opening. But most players who start with one d4 don't really want to play into an e4 opening. So here, my opponent now plays c4. And this is a slightly different move order to the Wojciech game. But again, your setup of black is the same. As black, classical Dutch, your first moves are f5, knight to f6, bishop to e7, castles kingside, d6. This is generally always the way you start the game with black. So just remember to get these moves in. And pay attention to what your opponent's playing. But this, what we're concentrating on these 5 videos is the setup where white fianchettos his bishop to g2. So obviously, if your opponent plays something else here, you might have to adapt your setup to that, whatever your opponent's doing. But if your opponent sets up with bishop to g2, generally just stick with his plan of development. Okay, so here I played f5, so entering into my classical Dutch. G3, so my opponent plays along the lines I'm used to, and now we go through the motions of knight f6, bishop e7, castles. So bishop g2, bishop e7, knight to f3, castles. So we have now reached the same position I had against Wojciech from a slightly different move order from white's though. My opponent now castled, and now the classical Dutch starts with the move d6. Now let's just try to talk about the pros and the advantages of playing d6 again. Well, the main advantages is to try to play e5 later on, and then f4. This is the pawn structure you're aiming for, e5 and f4 starting an attack. So this is why the pawn here supports the move e5. Now your position may look a bit cramped here, but it has a lot of potential. Okay, now the pieces you generally want to move in this start of the game is knight on f6. This comes to e4, as we'll see in the game. The bishop on e7 comes to f6. And the queen on d8 comes often to h5. Sometimes you combine this with the move a5, controlling the b4 square. But you rarely, in this opening position, it's worth pointing this out, rarely do you actually develop your bishop on c8 until much later on in the game. Your bishop on c8 can happily sit on that square. I mean, really, you want to try to develop your bishop on c8 to h3, believe it or not. That might sound absolutely ridiculous because there are 2 pawns in the way here on e6 and f5. But once these pawns move, your bishop wants to come flying out to the h3 square to start an attack. So that's your general idea here. Okay, now Shirov, in the last game, Wojciech played queen to c2. Shirov now played what I'd say the most normal move is, knight to c3, developing his knight. And here, well, unlike the game against Wojciech, knight to c6 is something you want to avoid playing here, really, because if you play this move too soon, you run into d5. And this destroys your pawn structure. Now, you always want to meet the move d5 with the move e5. And here, this is not possible because your knight on c6 is being attacked. Let's say, for example, once you move your knight, there's not really good squares, but let's say you move your knight back to b8, for example. Well, if it is your move here, you play e5, but your opponent now has time to do something like either knight to d4 or pawn takes e6. And both these moves I find quite unpleasant for black because now your pawn structure has been a bit destroyed and you can no longer play the move e5 here. So this is something you have to try to bear in mind and avoid falling into. Now, the move I'm going to recommend in this position is the move knight to e4. And this looks like the best move here and a move I've had a lot of success with. In this position, it's most likely your opponent will play queen to c2. This is the move that nearly everyone plays. Now, quickly, just very briefly, I'll just show you one line which will happen if your opponent doesn't play this and, for example, takes on e4. Now, originally, I thought this was a bit worrying for black's setup, but I think this is now okay as long as you play pawn takes e4. So now the white knight on f3 has to move. I think d2 is the best square. Now we continue with d5. There's a fair bit of work on this. I recommend you look at some of my other games to have a deeper look at this, but Generally, your ideas here are some moves like knight to c6, bishop to f6, and sometimes even c5. As long as you remember to play aggressively, you have to play very aggressively in this type of position, you should get an okay game. But let's see how Shearoff dealt with this opening, because of course Shearoff is a great attacking player, and this again, this game, it goes along the attacking theme, and we can see when Shearoff starts the attack against me. So it's really combining the opening play, this Dutch defense, with attacking chess. So hopefully you're getting two lessons of one here. Well, my opponent here now played the more common move, queen to c2. And this is what most players with the white pieces will play, increasing the pressure on the e4 square. So now my knight on e4 has to make a decision. Now, you should always take on c3. And again, white has a decision to make here. My opponent played the rather risky b takes c3. Now, first of all, let's have a look at what happens if he plays queen takes c3. This looks like a much more natural move to not double the white pawns. But, of course, Shearoff, being a very dynamic player, doesn't necessarily worry about considerations like double pawns. Now, queen takes c3 is more natural, and my opponent now wants to play b4, so we play another standard move here, pawn to a5, and this controls the b4 square here. And now, the plan now, this is one position which I think you could get a lot of time, so I'm just going to mention the plan that you need to play in this position. This is one reason why you've moved the knight on f6 away from the f6 square. Now, the one reason you move that knight away from f6 is to put your bishop on f6. And your one plan here, the only plan you need to remember, is bishop to f6, knight to c6 at the right moment, obviously, e5. This is your main idea. And once you can achieve this, you get a very good position. For example, let's say white plays some normal moves, b3. Bishop to f6, stage 1 of the plan. Bishop b2, knight to c6, stage 2 of the plan. Now, a crafty move like rook on ad1. If you go e5 straight away, well, that would allow white to take on e5, and now your pawn cannot capture because your queen's on pre. So that's a crafty move, rook ad1, but all we do to avoid that is go queen e8. Sticking to the same plan as before, the queen has potential over here, and we want to go e5. And after some move like e3, we can play e5 with a good attacking position. So this is what you're aiming for, really, when you play this opening, the move e5. So let's go all the way back to where I go knight to e4. And we just try to mention why I think knight to e4 is a good move. Well, number one, a little bit of advice to you here. If you've got a more cramped position, and black does have a more cramped position when he plays classical Dutch, it's a good idea to exchange pieces off, because that relieves the crampedness of your position. And by playing knight to e4 in this position, we're exchanging pieces off. We're making the position less cramped. So this is a very good plan. And the other main move, the other main idea is to give the f6 squared for our bishop. Okay, back to the game. Queen to c2 was played. And now I took on c3. My opponent took with his b pawn here. So b takes c3 is a very natural move to play here. And yeah, well, we've just looked at the other possibilities here. I mean, b takes c3 has one main idea in mind here. White wants to try to play e4. Now, as a rule, I mentioned this before, when your opponent plays e4, you never want to capture on the e4 square. This is bad. For example, if I play something like a5, then e4, capture, capture. White's clearly better because of the weakness against e6. So this is to be avoided. So what you want to do when you want to meet e4 to break e5, you have to play knight to c6 here, because if you don't play this move, knight to c6, you won't be able to meet e4 with e5. So knight to c6 is a very good move. Now, my opponent did continue with e4 here. It's worth mentioning here that if he goes d5, the move we generally worried about, then we go knight to a5 here. And now that white has doubled his c-pawns, this is not so bad for us. For example, we don't have to always go for the e5 move. Okay, it'd be great if we get it in, but we can play against our opponent's double pawns. So in this particular case, we can allow the move d5. Instead, my opponent played e4, which of course looks like the most logical move here. And how do you meet e4? We need to meet it with the move e5. And now my opponent played similar to Wojciech. He swapped off an e5, opening the d file. But instead now he played rook to b1. And this is a critical moment of the game. And I'm sure if Shirov was playing with the black pieces here, he'd win against most players in the world. Now, pros and cons of the position. White has two open lines, the D file and the B file. But I still have my standard attacking the plan, as we saw in the last game. Queen e8, queen h5, and now either f4 or f takes e4. This is your standard attacking plan here. It's worth noting in this game that f4 is a very strong possibility here as well, just to try to attack like that. So there's a number of strong attacking ideas for black here. Now, as I was playing Shirov, I got a bit overly worried here. And this, again, comes back to attacking in chess. Sometimes you just need to get on with the attack. And here, I saw my opponent's idea was to come rook b5. So I played the prophylactic move a6 here, which we'll come on to very shortly. Now, I think a much more interesting idea would have been f4 here. Just trying to push through on the king side. And we could even go caveman style with g5 if we really want to. This would have been a much more interesting idea and something which I'd play in the future. Okay, but let's have a look. So in the end, I played a6, stopping my opponent's plan, which maybe is not such a bad move. My opponent now played rook to d1. That's fine, because I can get on with my plan or bring my queen to h5. Queen e8, and now rook to d5. And here, this is where Shirov starts to take control of the game. Okay, he's pressurizing e5 here. And this moment I played a big mistake. I played bishop to e6, allowing Shirov to play a brilliant sacrifice. Now, before we move on to that idea, let's just have a look at what I should have played. I should have just controlled the e5 square with bishop to f6. And here I think black is just better, believe it or not. For example, bishop to a3, just rook to f7. If my opponent takes on f5, which looks like he's won a pawn, now I have to aim to take back this pawn with my bishop, and I can do that by playing bishop to e7. And the point being, I have bishop takes f5 flying in the game, and my pieces are very active. So this would have been a perfectly good position for me. But I got a bit greedy against Shirov, and one thing you should never do against Shirov is get greedy. Shirov loves sacrificing pieces, so getting greedy was just really stupid here. And I played bishop to e6. And like I said, this allows Shirov to sacrifice. Not a good idea. I don't know what I was expecting now. I mean, it was very strange. I could not have been expecting my opponent to retreat his rook, because that would have been just a waste of time for him. And now my opponent plays a brilliant strategy on the light squares. And I think this is very thematic to how Shirov plays the rest of the game. Certainly not the opening's fault here, but Shirov exploits my light squares very well here by playing a brilliant exchange sacrifice. He plays rook takes b7. And this is a brilliant idea. I'm now forced to take his rook on d5. And now c takes d5. And what does my opponent gain from this? Well, my light square bishop, which was on c8, was actually a key defender to my position, because a lot of the time it's coming to f5 and getting into the game via light squares. Now it's gone from the board. My opponent has a light square bishop, which becomes such a strong piece. This bishop on g2 can come into g6, can come into the game from a number of angles. My opponent has one pawn for the exchange, but my position is creaking somewhat. And my pieces are now forced to worse squares. So all this is involved from my opponent's very good exchange sacrifice he started. So knight to a5, I have to try to play aggressively. Rook to b1, just simply retreats. If he takes on c7 here, then his rook will get trapped with something like bishop to d6, and he can't lose two exchanges. Crazy. So in this position, he goes rook to b1, and now I played knight to c4. And here, my opponent just took on f5 with two pawns for the exchange. But his light square domination is a joy to watch. His pawns are on light squares. He wants to put his bishop on a light square. And just watch how he dominates the light squares, and the exchange sacrifice works perfectly. I have to try to play a bit passively here. My dark square bishop is a bad piece. There's another thing that plays an important role in the game. And now Shirov just simply exchanges off my one active piece. And this is a very good attacking idea. Anyway, when you're attacking, you still need to think strategically. And here Shirov's just thinking, well, the knight on c4 is an attacking piece. if I swap this knight off, I've increased my advantages in my position. I decided to keep this knight on the board, knight d6, but now Shirov uses his pawn majority of the d pawn and c pawn. And as soon as his d pawn moves as well, his bishop gets even more scope along the diagonal. Now, the rest of the game maybe not so important, but it's nice to see how Shirov played. Okay, I've got my queen h5 in, but it has no backup now because you're not going to checkmate your opponent just with one piece. I needed a bishop on c8 to attack and a knight on f6 to attack. Here, I don't have any backup, so it's clearly going to fail. Okay, so c5 was played. I now tried to take on f5 with my queen, but my opponent, who's a great calculator of the game, had calculated the following variation. Takes d6, attacking my rook on a8. I really don't think I can move this rook anywhere because his pawns are just becoming too strong. But again, look at his light square ideas here. This light square bishop, such a strong piece. So I gave up the exchange, but this gave me little joy. A very good check for the endgame, forced my king to a worse square. And we had a number of exchanges. My opponent kept playing aggressively. And as soon as he took on d6, his pawn proved to be too strong. We'll just see a couple more moves. King to f1. D pawn, far too strong. Pieces get exchanged, but my king was in back rank trouble. And here it's clear to see his D pawn's going to win the game. So a very nice game by Shirov. Not any fault of the openings there. Let's just go and have a look at the key moments. So again, we continue with our standard play of going knight to f3, d6, and knight to e4. So this is all kind of, this knight to e4 move is my recommended way of playing against knight to c3. So this is my suggested move here to give your f6 square for the bishop and to try to really uncramp your position and get e5 in. So an interesting game, I thought. Nice exchange sacrifice from Shirov. But again, this just shows you in this game more ideas in the classical Dutch and the idea of this knight to e4 move being successful. So hopefully that will help you understand Dutch a little bit more. We've got 3 more videos coming in the same series. And by then, hopefully, you're ready to be brave enough to play the Dutch in one of your own games. Welcome back, chess.com viewers, to my video series on the classical Dutch defense. This is the third video in my short 5-video series, combining this sort of classical Dutch opening video series with attacking chess, because most of the games shown here, an attack starts at some moment. So we're trying to just get to the moments where the attack does start and combine this with the ideas behind the classical Dutch. My opponent in this game was the very experienced Grandmaster, very strong Grandmaster, who now resides in the Netherlands, Sokolov, Ivan Sokolov, with the white pieces. This game, I believe, was played in 2006, 2006 in Reykjavik. And yeah, it was one of the first times I played such a strong player in the Dutch defense. And it was quite interesting. The night before, actually, I was having a drink with some American chess players, and they sort of saw I was playing Sokolov the next day. And these 2 American chess players, one of them was Ben Johnson, and the other one was Eli Swartz. And Elon Swartz basically mentioned that he's just taken up poker, and he's just been playing a bit of poker online, and it sort of was going okay. And he mentioned to me if I won this game, he'd take up the classical Dutch, and hopefully he did take it up after this. But the amusing thing about this was that next time, about 3 years after this tournament, I turned on my TV, and I'd play and watch a bit of poker myself, and I turned on the final table at the World Series of poker. which is the biggest poker competition in the world. And there was Elon Swartz sitting on the table. So he made it to the final table of the Poker World Series. But anyway, I thought that was quite a rare event to happen for any chess player. So we go for the opening moves again. So I played e6 on move 1. If you want to reach the Dutch, you can play 1f5. But again, you have to be prepared for some of the sidelines here, like the Staunton gambits and other ideas like this. But 1e6 is my normal way of reaching the Dutch defence. But the only problem here is if you're not a French defence player, you have to be prepared for e4. You have to have some idea against this. So e6 was my idea. And now, okay, my opponent did not play it in this way. He's always been a d4 player. So he plays c4. And I continue with my classical Dutch moves. So my setup here is knight f6, bishop e7, castle's kingside, d6. And hopefully you become familiar with these moves from the previous two videos. And in this series, we're only concentrating on g3 and what happens if white plays the main line, fianchettoing his bishop here. Now, in the last game, I will quickly mention what you should do against other setups, so you're fully covered in these 5 videos, but we're mainly concentrating on g3. So now we go for our idea, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, knight to f3, both sides castle, and now d6. So we've reached the starting moment of the classical Dutch. I've played all their main ideas, and now it's over to white what to play. Now, in most cases here, your next move is going to be knight to e4. That's one thing to remember. So your bishop can come to f6. So that's one of your main ideas here. Another idea is a5 to try to gain space on the queen side and support this b4 square. Another idea, which is quite common, at some point you go queen e8 to h5. Personally, I don't think you should rush this idea because it's much stronger when you've tried to get you've got to try to get the e5 breaking first. I think this is your first priority, one of your main priorities in the middle game. So my opponent now played knight to c3. As in my previous game against Shirov, I threw the knight into the center of the board, knight to e4. And this, again, I think is a very good way to play. The best move in the position. You've got a slightly cramped position, so you want to exchange pieces off the board. And I think one of the strongest lines is if white takes on e4 from a white perspective. Now, previously, we just looked at knight d2. I'll just show you some other ideas with this, so we give you a taster for what you should be thinking of. You're always going to guard your e-pawn with d5. Let's say your opponent goes knight to e1. Well, again, you've got to defend your e-pawn, so d5. And here, let's say he plays something like f3, trying to break up your pawn structure. Well, now, one very strong line here is for black, is if you can try to take advantage of the queen on queen situation here and the placement of white's knight on e1. One thing you I kind of try to avoid is positions where you take on f3, they take back with a knight. This is probably perfectly okay for black, and black's probably equal, just a bit dull. And when you play the classical Dutch, you do not want dull positions. So a much stronger line here be pawn takes c4. And if your opponent takes on e4, it may look like he's gained a strong center, but then you have this, even in this position, you have the strong move e5. A very interesting move which tries to take advantage of the pin on the queen on d1, leading to at least an equal position for black. So that gives you another taster of what happens if white takes on e4. But okay, my opponent in this position played a very sensible move, but a rare move, bishop to d2. And this idea is just trying to not double the pawns on the c-file and develop a piece. Makes a lot of sense. Here, I played knight to c6 with a particular idea in mind. I mentioned before, your one main thing to do is to play e5. So bishop to f6 would have been a good move here. But by playing knight to c6, I'm kind of preparing e5 again. And I saw in this position, I'm not worried about the advanced d5, which my opponent actually played. So after d5, my idea now was that, not a bit unlike the other positions we've seen where my knight's still on f6, I was now able to take on d2 with my knight. The point being, after my opponent recaptures on d2, I have a very good dark square bishop. He's lost his dark square bishop, and if you can look at where my dark square bishop is ideally placed, it's ideally placed on the f6 square, where it's just cutting across the board. And my bishop on f6 doesn't have any counterpart bishop that it can fight against. So this is a very strong piece, this bishop, this dark square bishop. So this is why I allowed the move d5. And generally your way of now meeting this d5 move, if you ever face it with knight on c6, is to put your knight into the center of the board. So knight to e5. And this is the best square for your knight. So now we'll just move through the middle game stage and see where it gets very tactical now, because I think later on, the opening stage, we're kind of coming to an end now after e3 and now c6. So I'm trying to open up the position. When you have two bishops, it's very important to try to open up the position for your bishops, and c6 is a move that does this, to try to open up the position. b4. This looks a bit unnecessarily weakening this diagonal, so I'm not sure this is a correct move. Okay, bishop f6, getting my bishop to a lovely square. And now we both develop over the next couple of moves. Queen c2, bishop d7. So now that the nature of the game has been changed, because I've got this dark square bishop, I'm simply trying to develop my pieces and get my rook to c8 to open up the c file with c takes d5. Okay, a takes d1, and now a5, again opening up more lines. b5, now I take on d5. My opponent recaptures and rook c8. So around here, of course, black should be doing well. My opponent has to defend passively because of threats. My immediate threat here is, let's say he goes a4, is rook takes c3, queen takes c3, knight to f3 check, winning the queen. So he cannot allow that, obviously. So he has to defend passively. Knight on d to b1 was played. Now I grab the pawn on b5, taking advantage of the pin. The reason I thought this was interesting, this game, was obviously for the opening, but also it's quite similar to the Shearoff game we just looked at. In this particular position, my opponents felt that his position was getting worse and worse. So again, he goes for a Shearoff-like idea, and it's all to do with the bishop on g2. My opponent now played d takes e6, sacrificing the exchange to try to increase the power of his bishop on g2. And this is a really good fighting move, and I think it shows you very good practical play. And again, this is, I think, a very good bit of advice for most people watching this video. If you feel your position is going wrong, or if you feel like something is not going right at all in your position, and it's getting worse and worse, sometimes the best way to defend is actively. Active defense is a very good way to defend, and by playing in this manner, white is actively defending. Even though he's losing material, he allows his bishop to enter the game. He gives the d5 square for his knight an option. So this is a very, very good option. Very good fighting move. Okay, I had to take the rook. King takes. Interesting decision. Not sure a correct one. Now, my king is a little bit exposed already on this diagonal, so I just tuck it out the way. A prophylactic move. Now, my opponent takes another pawn. Rook to c7. And now queen to b3. The only problem that white has is the lack of coordination with some of his pieces. So after this move, a4 was a very strange move just to uncoordinate my opponent's pieces. He can't take with the queen because he loses his bishop. So he takes with his knight, but now his knight can no longer come to d5. And important moment here where I want you as a viewer to combine some of the things we talked about in the previous videos from black's idea and also some attacking ideas. Now, it's a very unbalanced dynamic position. You're playing with black. I've told you some of black's typical ideas in the Dutch defense. There's one typical maneuver here, even in the middle game, that I employed that worked wonders. It's an idea that we've seen in the opening being played, but it worked absolute wonders in the middle game situation here. See, even ideas that come from openings can be used later on in the games. And I think as long as you get to know these concepts, you'll improve as a chess player. And indeed, as a classical Dutch player, you'll start to understand the positions a lot more. So what is the move I played? Well, the move I played is queen to e8. And this has the typical idea. I'll bring my queen around and attacking my opponent's king. And this works okay because I also have a knight, which is quite aggressively placed to start an attack as well. My opponent now played knight on b to c3, so he's trying to activate his pieces. Queen to h5. My opponent has to defend his king side. It's too passive to start defending with his king because my knight comes to g4. So instead, my opponent gives up his h2 pawn. Here, I played knight to f3, just continuing the attack. My opponent took this knight off. It's a very strong piece. I took with the queen, and now queen to d5 was a mistake. Our queen came back. We're going to get to a critical moment. Queen takes d6, rook to c8, king g2. I give my king an escape square. Knight to b5, and now an interesting move. My piece is now coming to attack. Okay, and again, knight b6. I've gone over the last couple of moves fairly quickly. We've reached, yet again, another critical moment in the game. Now, there's a lot of it. It's a very double-edged position. So what you have to do here, you have to really think any tempo loss in an attacking position is going to lose you the game. So you need to just think of moves which gain tempo, which attack as aggressively as possible. So my rook on c8 is on being attacked. But if I start moving this rook away, I'm losing so much time. So the way to think in double-edged positions is any move that goes forwards that attacks. Don't try to defend unless you have to. I really think it's better to go forwards to attack in double-edged positions to get your attacking first. Hence why f4 was played. And this simply opens up more lines for my pieces. My queen can now have some chance to attack the knight on b5. My opponent took on f4. Now, one line worth mentioning is if he takes on c8, then I just play f3 check. And after king here, queen to h3. And we can see the move h6 has given my king a very useful escape square. And if something like rook to g1, then rook to c1 will lead to checkmate. A nice variation there, and it would have been a nice final position. So it stops my opponent taking on c8 through active play, f4. And instead of playing this, well, my opponent just played e takes f4. But now the point behind my play is queen to e2 comes, and it gives me more options of checking on e4, so I've removed his e pawn, and my queen has more scope. Let's see if you can find a finish. Rook to f1 has to defend f2, and it's all about speed here. Queen to e4 check. This is the move that f4 allowed me to play. King to g1. Critical moment here again. I'm going to give you, the viewer of this video, just maybe 30 seconds. In this position, black to play. What should black play here? It's, again, critical for how you improve as a chess player. Go along with my thinking from before. If you start defending by moving this rook, you're going very passive. So try to look at attacking moves first. Try to look at the most aggressive moves first. And try to look at everything that throws pieces towards your opponent's king. At the moment, he's only defending with one rook. So how can we expose his king more? Well, I think a very nice finish here was the move rook takes f2. And the point being, well, if king takes f2, he runs into checkmate with rook c2, king here, queen g2. So that would have been mate. Instead, my opponent took with, after rook takes f2, he played rook takes f2. But now, with a forcing sequence, he can't survive. I go rook c1 check, only one move, rook f1, and now rook c2 anyway. Threatening queen to g2 check. If he goes rook f2 here, queen to e1 check will lead to mate. You can work that out yourself at home. My opponent instead played queen to d5. But now Queen to e2 threatens mate on h2. There's only one way to stop this. Queen to h1, but now it's checkmate in 2 moves. I'm not even going to show you the final move of the game. I'm sure you can work this move out for yourself. Black to play and win with checkmate in 2 moves. Okay, so I think again it shows you some thematic ideas here. Let's just go back for the opening. In this standard position here, this knight to e4 was a very good plan. And after bishop to d2, only now did I play knight to c6, allowing d5, because I was able to swap off his dark square bishop. And in this type of position, I have bishop on e7 that could be a dominating piece. So only in particular circumstances is it a good idea to allow this d5 move to be played. But anyway, obviously I enjoyed that game quite greatly there. And I know Sokolov quite well since that game. Obviously, he was a bit upset losing to someone like me at that stage of my chess career, but one of my better results. And yeah, it was a good game. Celebrated with the Americans after that, so that was quite fun. And yeah, the Dutch has served me well. So that was the third game in the series. Please have a look at the other videos. There's 2 more videos to watch in this, which should give you a very good understanding of the opening. We're now going to have a look at my game against Boris Gelfand in the Classical Dutch. A real honour to play Gelfand, especially in the tournament I played him in, because Gelfand obviously is from Israel, and the competition here was the European Team Championships for individual teams. I was playing for my English team, Jutes of Kent, and I was playing Gelfand in Israel with the black pieces, and I was really hoping to get Gelfand on the top board. And luckily I was paired against him. And this was very soon after his match against Anand for the World Championships. So it was just a real honour to play him. And to be honest, I really don't know how I won the game. It's a real shock to me and quite a surprise. It's one of those games we probably remember for the rest of your life. I mean, okay, I'm a grandmaster, but I'm certainly not a grandmaster in the league of Gelfand. Gelfand is incredibly strong grandmaster, and I'm just some English grandmaster who plays the Dutch defence. So it was, yeah, probably my best victory of all time. And I think really the opening helped me achieve that victory a lot, even against one of the strongest players in the world. I was able to play the classical Dutch. And even though my opponent had prepared for this opening, so he had time to come up with a system to play against it. So even with all these things against me, I was still able to get a good position and to get a winning game against him. You can only imagine the feeling when he shook my hand at the end of the game. I mean, I was quite nervous before the game, I think, unsurprisingly, and had a bit of the shakes, but got into the flow very quickly. We'll talk about what happened after the game at the end. He was very polite, should I say, very, very gentlemanlike. But let's move straight into the game. So the game started d4. And again, I've talked about the pros and cons of going f5 and move 1. And this is the typical way to enter the Dutch, but I normally go e6. And we reach the classical Dutch again. So in the next video, we'll have a quick look at other setups that white can play. But the main idea, the main move that white will play is g3. And our main continuation here is knight to f6, bishop e7, castles, d6. So very easy to remember this way of getting your pieces out and your king castled. So knight to f6 was played, bishop to g2, bishop to e7 was played. It's worth noting that I once tried bishop to b4 check against Svidler in the Bumrati Congress, and I think this is a pretty decent move, unless they continue with knight to d2. And I think knight to d2 is a very good response to bishop to b4 check. And this is one reason I do not put my bishop on this square. Often I'm going to have to exchange this bishop off for my opponent's knight, losing the bishop pair. And I lost very quickly to Svidler in that game. So bishop to e7, continuing the standard fashion. Knight to f3, both of us castled, castled, castled. And now classical Dutch move, d6. So again, I'd say this is the starting point of the main line classical Dutch. We've obviously talked about knight to c3 already and queen to c2. My opponent played his next move very quickly, and it's a very logical move. Pawn to b4. And I think this is a good system for white. White immediately gains a strong majority on the queen side, which is going to be cramping for me later on. He wants to push forwards with b5 later on, and he just gets a space advantage. Now, the way I'm going to recommend playing against this is to combine your typical idea, which you should know by now, of knight to e4 and bishop to f6. This is one of the main ideas of this, with the push of r8 pawn. This is my recommended way of playing against b4, combining these two ideas. Now, obviously, if you can get e5 in again at the right moment, the correct moment, that's quite good, but it's not so easy to do in this variation. So, okay, I played a5. My opponent continued with b5, logical fashion. And now I continue with the second part of my plan, knight to e4. Again, trying to combine this with bishop to f6, pressure along the diagonal. And I'm slightly more cramped, so any exchange of this knight on e4 will benefit me. My opponent now played queen to c2, a useful move. The queen is adding a little bit of pressure to e4, and it's just a little bit more secure on this square. So, of course, now when we're playing chess, we have to look at all our pieces. And we don't, in the Dutch defense, the classical Dutch, as mentioned before, worry too much about our bishop on c8 until later on. Instead, we concentrate on our kingside pieces. So bishop to f6 was played. And the bishop creates threats along this diagonal, puts a bit of pressure on d4, and in some cases prepares the move e5. This is another bonus having the bishop on f6, preparing the move e5. My opponent continued bishop b2, so controlling the e5 square indirectly and defending against d4. So what moves would you consider here? Again, now you've played some of the ideas we've mentioned, and there's a number of ideas. Queen to e8 is not so ridiculous. That's not such a bad move. But as I said before, when I'm playing against this system, I try to combine the ideas of having my knight and bishop on these two squares with pressure with my a pawn. So here I played a4. Now, the main point behind this is that if my opponent ever moves his knight on b1, which is the only piece he hasn't developed, so let's say he goes knight to d2 here, then I can flick in the move a3. And this leaves this bishop on b2 rather short of squares, because I can either exchange it off if it comes to c3, or if it goes to c1, it becomes incredibly passive. So this is the main idea behind the a4 move. It also makes this pawn on b5 slightly weak, maybe later on if I go c6 and take on b5, because he cannot support his b5 pawn with a4 anymore. So positionally and tactically, quite good idea. So my opponent played, instead of knight on b to d2, knight on f to d2. And this made more sense because he's controlling a3 and he wants to get rid of my strong knight on e4. Now, always in this type of position, you have to consider whether you should take on d2 or play d5. Now, there was an argument here for me playing knight takes d2, and after knight takes d2, e5. This would have been thematic to the opening, and I expect this position is perfectly playable for black. But I actually got quite attracted with the idea of playing d5 here, which is the move I played. And this game I thought was worth mentioning for a number of reasons, but also we haven't looked at the concept of going d5, reaching a delayed stone wall position. And here we can see that this position should work out quite well for me, because my bishop and knight are well placed, and my a pawn is a nuisance for him. So d5 is a move you can use sometimes to stabilize your knight on the e4 square. But I'd only recommend playing d5 when your opponent has passive pieces. In this position, Gelfand does. He has a knight on d2, a knight on b1, passive pieces. This is why I actually gain a bit of a space advantage here with this move. My opponent now developed his last piece, knight to a3, and he stops my a pawn going any further forwards. So when you're in a middle game, you've got to think of a plan to play. Even a bad plan is played with no plan. As I mentioned before, his pawn on b5 was a slight weakness. I could, of course, continue with something like bishop to d7, when one typical idea in the stone wall Dutch and also the French defense Dutch is to bring this bishop around to the king side. So you go bishop d7, bishop e8, bishop g6 or h5, and your bishop enters the game. And we will see this actually in practice later on here. But as I mentioned before, I often don't like committing my bishop on c8 until a later moment. So instead, I try to create some pressure against this pawn structure with c6. Now, white does have a space advantage, but I do have a good stronghold in the center. Gelfand played rook b1, trying to get his rook ready for opening of the b file. And now my bishop comes to d7, so I now try this plan into action. My opponent here should probably play the move e3 at some moments. This is a nice solid move, and then he could claim some space advantage, but I don't think it's anything serious for me. Instead, Gelfand played rook on f to c1, again preparing for the opening of the queen side, but he's kind of neglecting his king side. And now we're coming to another moment where I'm saying I'm kind of combining this classical Dutch opening lecture on when to start an attack. And already here, I saw that my opponent was moving his pieces, all of his pieces, over to the queen side of the board. So all his pieces are stuck over there, which means that his king side is a little bit exposed. He only has his bishop on g2 defending it. I have potential to start an attack with my Dutch f pawn. And this is one of the great things about the Dutch. You can use this f pawn at a certain stage to start an attack. So already I had envisioned an attacking idea here. I played bishop to e8, first of all, and try and improve the positioning of my bishop. My opponent now blundered, made a mistake with knight to f3. So it seems a bit strange to bring his knight here, then bring it back again. It makes little sense to me. And okay, he's trying to get a hold on the e5 square, but now it's time to play actively. Again, it's like I noted this on the move before, that he's moved his pieces over here. His king side's a little bit exposed. So a question for you out there. You're a Dutch player. You want to play as actively as possible. You've played some very sensible moves. Your queen side is all defended at the moment, so don't worry about your queen side. Concentrate on the king side. What is a typical attacking Dutch move here to start an attack on the king side? f4. f4 is the move to play, especially now that my bishop can come to g6, a very strong move and the strongest move in the position. Now, my opponent cannot capture on f4, because bishop to g6 would leave him struggling extremely bad position. He has to move his queen, something like queen to d1. And now all of a sudden my position just comes to life. Bishop to h4. f2 is weak. My rook is coming to f4. I will have all my pieces pretty much, except for these guys on the queen side, every other piece attacking his king. And he hasn't got enough defenders. So it's really, again, like I said, the Dutch, you have to try to find the right moment to attack. And here, going back to when to attack, I spotted my opponent's piece on the other side of the board. I spotted a move, a line opening move. In order to start an attack against your opponent's king, you have to open lines. f4 is a line opening move. That's why I played the move. And now my opponent decided to move his queen away, queen d1. So I opened up his king side a bit more. F takes g3. He took with the h-pawn. So I've created some weaknesses around his king side, and I've opened up my f-file. Bishop to g6. And I'll be honest here, I was feeling very confident and very excited at this moment because I suddenly realised, hang on a minute, I've got a very good position. After 17 moves with the classical Dutch, my position is to be preferred by logical standard moves. Let's see how my position came to life even more. He took on c6, desperately trying to create counterplay on the queen side. I took back and developed a piece, and now he came in knight b5, a good move, trying to play actively. How do I make progress here? Well, I want to open up my rook, and my bishop on f6 is not really doing much here. So bishop to g5, logical move, attacking his rook. My opponent countered with bishop to a3. There's a number of good moves here. I stuck with a simple rook to f7 move. My opponent thought he had to capture on g5, and now queen takes g5. We can see my pieces are getting nearer to his king. f2, a critical weakness. This is all starting with the move f4. f4 is often a key attacking move in the classical Dutch. Please remember to play this move. My opponent has to remove this knight on e4, otherwise his king is too weak. The f2 pawn is too weak. So he went bishop takes e4. Now, bishop takes e4 would be a mistake because knight to d6, and he's able to get rid of this piece on e4. Instead, just pawn takes e6 keeps me with a good attacking position. My opponent played queen to e1, and now, again, when you're attacking, when you've got the initiative, play as actively as possible. You do not want to lose the initiative. e3, using all the assets in my position to try to open up his weakened king. f3, he has to give up the exchange on b1, otherwise he would have got mated. And now I just simply took on b1, rook takes b1, and again, like I said before, even when you have a good position, I clearly have a good position here, you do not want to take your foot off the gas. You've got to keep applying pressure to your opponent's position. This is key. You've got to keep putting pressure on your opponent. And here, this is exactly what I did. Rook f6. I want to just bring my rook around and checkmate him on the newly opened h-file. King to g2 was played, trying to defend against this. And rook h6 was played anyway. And now my opponent is struggling severely here because of queen h5. He tried the defensive move g4, stopping queen h5. And here, I think it was a mixture of nerves and everything else. I mean, if I'd have just kept my cool here, I'm sure I would have seen the move which would have won immediately. Instead, the game went on, and it was a very messy game, which maybe we won't look at in its entirety. I could have played knight takes d4 here, where my opponent could have resigned. And the funny thing was, actually, when I played the move in the game, I played knight to e7 instead, thinking of moving this knight around to his king side. And my opponent just shook his head and looked absolutely shocked that I played this move. Obviously, he had seen knight takes d4, and he'd seen that he was completely lost here. The point being after this, if my opponent now recaptures on d4, I just go queen to f4. And I'm threatening mating threats on h2 and his knight on d4. He has to play something like queen to g3, and I simply take on d4 with exchange up in a winning position. So that's my first chance. And normally you don't get two chances against such a strong player, but we'll go through some of the moves. It was quite interesting. I played knight to e7. My opponent took off this piece, and he managed to stabilize queen g3. Okay, I think the rest of the game is a bit insignificant and not that important. Okay, I did manage to win the game. I mean, it involved a nice tactic at the end. You can look at this game, obviously, on on the database or something, so it will be there. So you can find this game. But I think we've gone over the most important parts of the game, and we'll just try to emphasize those moments again. So from the opening, we just had this standard setup from black, and my opponent played b4. Now, the way to play against b4 is combining knight to e4, bishop to f6, and the a pawn. And this is precisely what I did. So a pawn goes first, then knight to e4. And then when his bishop comes to b2, the annoying move a4, with the possibility of going a3 at some moment, trying to stop my opponent's coordination. And now the other critical moment was later on. When your opponent threatens to take on e4, you always have to wonder between taking or getting stone wall structure. Stone wall structure completely validated here because of my active pieces. The next critical moment was, let's just go to the position. In this position, after knight to f3, the move that gave me all this, my position, all this energy, the move that started my attack. And this is when you're looking for attacks in positions, try to look for line opening moves. You also have to notice certain characteristics of the position, like when your opponent has pieces on the other side of the board. And the position works perfectly for me to play the move f4 here. And a move f4, everything comes to life. My bishop comes to life to g6. I open up the f file, and the attack should have been unstoppable, even though I luckily managed to win the game. So I think that was quite a nice example of how the Dutch works, and against some of the strongest players in the world. My opponent was, I mean, I was shaking at the end of the game after, best victory of my life, and my opponent was very nice. He when he resigned, he actually said, "I'd like to congratulate you on your victory." How many times has your opponent ever said that to you? Which I thought was quite phenomenal, that my opponent was actually congratulating me on my victory. It was unbelievable. I repaid the favor a day later. I was playing Nakamura, and I was in a rush because obviously Nakamura plays so quickly. And there was only one toilet in the whole of the playing hall, and I was rushing to this toilet, and there was only one door for the toilet, entrance in the toilet, and I opened the door very quickly to get into the toilet because I was in a bit of time trouble. And I banged the door straight into someone's face on the other side of the door. And this poor guy ended up on the floor with his glasses broken. And I looked around to see who it was, and it was Gelfand. It was Gelfand. I gave him a double whammy, so I beat him in the chest. And the next day, accidentally, I have to say, I opened the toilet door straight into his face. I knocked his glasses off his face, and he was there laying on the floor. I felt absolutely terrible. Obviously a complete accident, but he really must hate me. The guy just must. I must not be in his videos. So I feel the Gelfand, one of the nicest guys in chess. In future, when I open toilet doors, I'll do them a lot more. Anyway, interesting game.
eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through?
In the final game in our series on the classical Dutch, and from the black point of view, should I mention, we're going to have a look at a game between some two players that don't involve me. So we've got Henriks with the white pieces against Igor Glek with the black pieces. Igor Glek, very strong player. I mean, he's been over 2,600 before, and he has played the Dutch on and off for his life. It should be noted that even though the classical Dutch is not so popular nowadays, it has been played by some of the world's best players. Macau Tau famously won a great game with the classical Dutch. Bob Tvenik has played the Dutch. Alekijn, another Dutch player. Nigel Short, nowadays, currently, well, has played the Dutch a couple of times. So it has got a history of strong players playing it. It just doesn't seem to be very popular at this moment in time. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why. So in this game, the final game of our series, we're just going to have a look at a typical middle game position that's a rise through the Dutch and another great victory from black. We're also going to only very quickly, briefly mention other setups that white might adopt after 2 or 3 moves. So we're not going to look at anti-Dutch systems. So anti-Dutch systems start with d4, f5, and here there's a number of anti-Dutch systems, which I would implore you to study as well if you want to start the game with 1f5. Now, I will start the game with 1e6 to avoid these systems, but of course, the French defense may not be in your repertoire after e4. So, I mean, anti-Dutch systems after f5 you have to be aware of are the Staunton gambits. I know Thomas Rendell has covered this, so you might be able to look at his video there. Early bishop g5 move, so that's another line you might want to look at. Knight to c3 in this position. They're the 3 main moves, should I say, in the Dutch defense, the anti-Dutch. But we're going to have a look at positions. Okay, well, the move order was slightly different here. I mean, g3, knight f6, I'd say go e6 there. But after bishop g2, e6, not much has changed here. And we're quickly getting to our normal type of position. So from what else can white play after something like e6, now c4, f5? What other kind of structures can white go for if he doesn't try to fianchetto this bishop on g2? Well, as a bit of advice, this is a simple bit of advice. If white doesn't fianchetto his bishop on g2 and he tries to put it on e2 or d3, I would recommend you stick with a plan of going b6 and bishop b7. So these are different positions to what we've looked at, but you're trying to take advantage of the fact that your opponent hasn't put his bishop on g2. So in order to achieve this, you can go knight to f6 first, bishop to e7 first, see how your opponent sets up his pieces, and then go b6. So for example, let's say he goes knight to c3, we go knight to f6, and let's say he plays something strange like e3 here. The idea of going bishop to d3. Well, I remember one game that I'll just quickly show you this game, which continued b6, because now it's clear white doesn't want to put his bishop on g2. And now a game continued bishop to d3, bishop to b7, knight to f3. So I expect you'll get this a lot at club level. Bishop to b4. So now that your bishop, I mean, in the regular lines, we put it on e7, but sometimes it can be put on b4. And in this position, it makes a lot of sense to put it on b4 because really you're fighting for control of the e4 square with your bishop on b7, your knight on f6. So the bishop on b4 increases the control on e4 by pinning the knight on c3. And now there's one great game I saw which continued. I'll just show it very quickly. Castle's kingside, a3, black took, knight to e4, so this move comes in again, queen c2, and now a lovely idea here called the rook lift idea, and this only works when your opponent has not fianchettoed his bishop. Rook to f6. with a simple plan of moving this rook to g6 or h6 and checkmating the black king. And this is a lovely idea. The game in question continued a4, rook g6, lining up some nasty ideas here. And now a5, and there was some devastating attack here, I believe, which continued with knight to g5. And all pieces were released against g2. And this ended very quickly, the game in question. So this is one idea worth bearing in mind if your opponent develops his bishop to d3. But I'd say wait and see. And if he does do something else here, then you can go b6. b6 is a logical move. Now his knight's on c3. You can consider going bishop to b4 as well. That's the way I'd probably play this position. This is why in a lot of top-class games, white generally doesn't play his knight to c3 too quickly. So he might continue something like c4, f5, and now if he goes g3, we're back into our main line. And if he goes knight to f3, we can go knight to s6. So we're still waiting to see what opponent does. And if he goes knight to c3, we can go bishop to b4. So this would be my other recommendation. If he goes knight to c3 too soon, go bishop to b4. Now, we don't go bishop to b4 in the main lines after g3 because of knight to d2 check. And I don't particularly like these ideas, these variations for black. So only when your opponent has gone knight to c3 can you try bishop to b4. Now, what other things have people tried against me? Well, I've had, let's say, knight to c3 in this position, knight to f6, and bishop to g5 here. Now, this is quite a crafty idea because often white is aimed to take on f6 and go pawn to e4. And this is something you have to be aware of. Now, again, I think here you have time to play b6 quickly because often this b6 move is a great idea. And then there's one game I had where my opponent tried this idea prematurely of taking on f6 and going e4. And here I was simply able to take and play a very annoying bishop to b4 check. But okay, I mean, generally, we're not going to go into it in too much depth. But as a general rule, I think worth remembering that in these positions earlier on, the classical Dutch, you have to be quite flexible. If your opponent goes for the kingside fianchetto, then just aim for the stuff we've looked at in previous videos. If he plays other lines, then you don't have to play your bishop on e7. If he puts his knight on c3 too quickly, you can put your bishop on b4. So that's one way to play. If he puts his bishop on d3 rather than g2, then you can develop your bishop to b7. And you can even consider, once you've castled, the rook lift idea when he's castled as well, of checkmating his king. So just bear in mind all these ideas when playing the classical Dutch. But now let's move on to the game in question, have a look at this typical middle game position that was reached. So g3 was played, here, here, here. So we get our standard stuff, and we know how we're going to develop now. We're going to go bishop e7, castles, d6. Very straightforward. White plays c4. Now bishop to e7, back into our normal line, knight to f3. Both sides castled, and black played d6. So white now played knight to c3. Now, we've looked at queen c2 in my first game against Wojciech. We have looked briefly at knight to c3 against Shirov, my game against Shirov. And Gelfand played b4 against me here. Now, another move that's quite common is the move b3. How do you think you should play against this? I just want to give you 5 seconds with all the knowledge you should have obtained from the first 4 videos of how you should play against this move. Well, you should play knight to e4 here. This is your best line. By playing b3, white has slightly weakened this diagonal, and the standard idea for black in these positions is to go knight e4, bishop to f6, and pressurize. And here, this is a great move. After bishop to b2, you can go bishop to f6 here. And again, now your standard plan here is something like knight to c6, e5. This is what you're aiming for in this type of position. And you can look at this in more depth in the databases. You know, there is a bit of theory on this, but this is your general way of thinking in this line. Just go knight to e4. Okay, but in the game in question, knight to c3 was played. And hopefully you can remember what I suggested as black's best move here. Knight to e4. Yep. And okay, now we're going to get to a typical middle game position. And the reason I wanted to include this game is because I've seen this middle game position, and in my own experience, the type of position we're going to reach here comes up in a majority of games. So I think it's very important for you to understand what ideas you're trying to achieve in the middle game. And this is with queen to c2. So now you take on c3. So by playing your knights into the center and exchanging off a pair of pieces, you had a cramped position, but exchanges are good when you have a cramped position. Queen takes c3 was played, and now b4 is an annoying idea in a lot of positions, as we saw Gelfand play. So a5, trying to gain space and maybe put a knight on b4 later on and just gain a bit of space on the queen side. I like this move, a5. And now b3 was played. Now, I'm just trying to test your memory here from the first game because we've had a bit of games in between. And I did ask you about this position. I said, what is your plan here? Now, please have a think about what plan you should be playing here with black. Hopefully by now you've got to grips with the opening principles and even the middle game principles. What move should you be trying to achieve in this position? How can you achieve that move? How can you get your pieces out to the best potential squares? Well, Gleck played bishop to f6, the best move. And this is the plan. You want to go e5. e5 is one of your main objectives in the classical Dutch. And to prepare to move e5, your bishop helps out defend the square. Your knight can also help out defend the square. And your queen, if needed, can come to e8, and in some cases, even e7. This is your main idea. You want to go e5 and even g5 later, and just gain space on this side of the board. So bishop f6 is the first stage to achieving this. Bishop to b2, what do you play next? Knight to c6, the correct move. Pressurizing d4 and preparing e5. Now, quick question, just try to think about this in your head, in your mind's eye. What move as black do you have to normally be worried about when you play knight to c6? There's one move you need to be concerned about on a general basis when you play knight to c6. Well, normally the move you have to worry about is d5 from white. This is the move that you normally stops you playing knight to c6 earlier on because d5 breaks up your pawn structure. Clearly d5 is not possible here because the queen on c3 would be munched. So we don't want to do that. Okay, and now rook on a to d1 was played. So white temporarily stops you playing e5. Or if you do play e5, you don't get the position you'd like to get. Because whenever white takes on e5, you want to catch back with your pawn. And you want to keep your two pawns centralized like this. And here, that will always give you a better middle game position. But clearly, you cannot play this now because of the pin on your pawn. So what do you play after rook d1? How do you get over this? Well, queen to e8, another standard idea. The queen steps out of the way of the rook, gives even more protection to the move e5, and prepares in some positions to come over to h5. This is a lovely, really well played game. Rook on fe1. So white is preparing his own play with e4. What move should you play here as black? Thematic middle game play. e5. Yep, this is the move. Now you can play e5. You should play e5. I'm always happy in this type of position if my opponent closes a position down with d5. After I move my knights, I have a great pawn storm coming up on the king side and a very good attack. So the best option here for white is always to capture on e5. And now Gleck took back on e5. Here the threat is pawn to e4. Already black has gained a very decent space advantage here. But the only mistake Gleck made in this game is that after e4, he played the slightly inferior move queen to g6 here. Now, I've actually had this in 2 games myself. The way to continue against this e4 move, you can, by the way, you can consider playing f4, which is interesting. But the best move here is pawn takes e4, rook takes e4, runs into bishop to f5. And then after the rook moves back, we can play e4, which is actually winning for black because our bishops are too strong. So the best line after taking for white is to try to go knight to d2 here. So we're just, and then black again is in the Dutch. It's all about developing with tempo, with speed. Bishop to g4, attacking the rook, and when the rook moves, knight to d4. All pieces are going forwards. And look, we're a pawn up. We're threatening knight to e2. We're winning the game. this is just a very strong idea. So even against a strong player, you can still get very good positions. So the best way to meet e4 in a number of options is to take e4, and also now you can see why some of the things I was saying earlier on in my videos and the previous videos about leaving the bishop on c8 come into action here. Well, actually, you often leave the bishop on c8 because it wants to come out to a more active square later on in the game. There's no point putting it on d7 or e6. It has better potential later on. So I think this e4 move doesn't really help the case for white. But okay, let's have a look at the game because it's still a very interesting middle game position. Black played queen to g6, makes a lot of sense. And white took, and now bishop takes f5. And again here, well, black is better here still. I think taking on e4 is more superior. But this is the kind of position you're aiming for when playing the classical Dutch. This is like your typical position, every piece developed, knight developed, bishop's very active, queen active. Your isolated pawn does not matter so much because it can actually be used as a strength. But your pieces are much better than white's pieces. And let's just see how Gleck used this initiative to gain a good position. Well, queen to e3, getting out of the way of the bishop, but e4 was played anyway, using this isolated pawn to attack with. Knight to d4, and now bishop takes d4, simply rook to d8. And all the black's pieces are working well. h3, preparing g4, h5, stopping this plan. Bishop to c3, and now the rook comes into d3. And this isolated pawn, as we can see, is slowly becoming a very strong pawn. Okay, I mean, I don't know if black's advantage is so great. He should have taken on e4 earlier. But the way the game continued, he slowly outplayed his opponent. And okay, I mean, white sort of played this bishop d5 check at some stage. But the big chance here really that Gleck missed, rather than going queen to g6, we won't look at the rest of the game because it's pretty irrelevant. Instead of queen g6, which was played, he should have captured on e4. And this, as we just noted, would have led to a very good position and very good play for black. But again, very thematic from black. The whole opening strategy worked out well. Let's just go through it again. So you really go knight to e4, and then given a chance, you capture on c3. You take a timeout here to stop b4. You go a5, stopping that. And now you're just trying to aim for e5. And this is exactly what Gleck did with his pieces maneuvering. And then he got e5 in with a better position. So some final thoughts about the Dutch defence. Thank you for listening to these videos. Obviously, Dutch has been a long-term weapon of mine, and I still use it nowadays. And I think it's a great opening, very underrated. You can get some great attacks, as I've shown you in some of my games, against some of the best players in the world. It's worked out brilliantly for me. And I think it's a really good weapon, not so well known. It might take you a while to understand it. I recommend that before you dive in and play it, you look at some anti-Dutch lines, or even learn the French defense. So after d4, try to understand some possibilities with e6, because it's very rare your opponent's going to go e4 here, but you do have to be prepared for e4. So we've really concentrated on the g3 Dutch with these videos, so you should be very well prepared to play the classical Dutch against the g3 system. I wish you best results for that. And just remember the typical ideas. Try to get e5 in later on. So in this position, e5 is a key move. But another key idea is knight to e4, bishop to f6. And the other key idea is a5, just gains the space on the queen side. Queen e8, queen h5 should not be forgotten about either. So I really hope you enjoyed those videos. And please leave some comments. It might be... I know these videos are quite advanced because they're looking specifically at one variation, but we have combined it with when to attack in certain positions as well. So hopefully you've seen, as well as learning an opening, you've seen into my mind's eye and seen how I've gone about attacking and getting some great victories in my own games. And I wish you the best of luck with your Dutch games in the future. So I hope to see a new resurgence with the opening now. Okay, bye for now. Hope to see you all soon.